Welcome to Small Arm Solutions. Today we're looking at the Smith Wesson 1006. This is a relatively important firearm in the history of the 10mm cartridge. If we're going to go back in time to when it was developed, we have to go back to around 1986 was when the popularity hit. But from the beginning, this cartridge was pretty much adopted out of necessity. So we'll start off in 1983. That was when Darnos and Dixon came out with the 10mm cartridge, which was for their Bren 10. Bren 10 was based off of the CZ75 type pistol. A much more powerful semi-automatic pistol. Basically, they wanted to give a semi-automatic pistol the same trajectory and the same power that you get out of a 3.7 Magnum. The Bren 10, unfortunately, was plagued with difficulties in manufacturing and reliability. And around 1986, they were forced to close up shop. The Bren 10 was given notoriety as well as the 10mm cartridge in the series Miami Vice back in the 80s, where Crockett was using a Bren 10 as his duty pistol until Crockett switched over to a Smith Wesson 4506. Now, the cartridge was developed by Jeff Cooper along with Norma back in the early days for the purposes that I had mentioned. Now, come 1986. 1986, there was a very, very notorious police officer shooting in Miami. It involved the FBI and two suspects. And in that firefight, there ended up being 2 dead FBI agents and 4 wounded, and 1 walked away unscathed, and 2 suspects were killed. However, this really showed the lack of equipment or the lack of modern weapons that were used by the FBI. The FBI was basically taken down with one of the suspects' Mini 14 for the most part. The rest of the FBI were pretty much armed with 2 of them had semi-automatic 9mm, 1 had a shotgun, and the rest had different variations of 38 Magnum revolvers. So it basically showed the FBI that they needed to upgrade their arsenal to be more in line with what the criminals were using, to a modern semi-automatic pistol. Now, when they went to look for a pistol, they determined that the 10mm was ideal law enforcement for their field agents. And they adopted the Smith & Wesson 1076. Now, the 1076 is a little bit different from what you see here. What you see here is the 1006. 1006 means we have a ambidextrous slide-mounted safety, single action as well as double action. 1076 was also double action, but it was a decock only, very much like the SIG. And it had a bobbed hammer, so there was very much anti-snag. Well, they found out very, very directly that this was not practical for law enforcement. They found with their agents at large, the recoil was far too unmanageable, and the gun was too big for their agents to use. And they ended up making some changes. But talking a little bit about the specific firearm, again, the 1076 was the one that was adopted. The 1006 happened to be one of the more popular ones, is what you see here. I do want to put a call out to Brandon over at the gun room for loaning this to us for us to review. And it's very interestingly enough, this was the pistol that Brandon went to the police academy with. So he definitely picked probably one of the most powerful handguns he probably could have to go through the academy. So this is a special gun to him. So with the fact that this pistol was required to be used by all federal agents in the FBI, it was literally too much. So the FBI Firearms Training Unit ended up having to go do some rethinking of their concept. And what they did was they came out with a cartridge that was called the 10mm Light. As we see here, we have the standard 9mm cartridge, which at that point was used by the FBI very, very limited. Again, 2 of the people at the Miami shootout had that. Over here, we have the powerful 10mm. Again, we have a lot more recoil and a much larger gun that was very, very uncomfortable for the officers to shoot. They were not shooting it effectively. Now we have what was referred to as the 10mm Light, or the 10mm FBI, which ended up being called the 40S&W. The 40S&W, basically, as you would see, is much shorter. As you can see, it's in line with the size of the 9mm. This would allow guns to be the exact same size as the 9mm. Generally have maybe 2 or 3 rounds less than the 9mm. But when you look at the differences in here in recoil and in power, you're looking at about 200 feet a second less out of the 40S&W as you are out of the 10mm, and sometimes a little bit more depending on the bullet weight. So it was a pretty dramatic decrease in velocity. However, you still had the mass. The way this was always looked at was if you look at the 45 Auto, which we don't have here, but the 40S&W was supposed to have the capacity of the 9mm, the recoil of the 9mm, with the power of the 45 in one. So you're supposed to have several characteristics of the cartridge in one. The 40S&W is developed as a joint venture between Smith & Wesson and Federal, and designed around the 40S&W model 4006. Now, the interesting thing about the 40-06 was, at the SHOT Show that year, Federal was there showing their ammunition. Well, Colt Glock was able to get his hands on a couple of those cartridges and go back to Austria. And when he went to Austria, at that time, he was working on a 10mm, his G20. He saw the writing on the wall that the 10mm was not going to have the presence of law enforcement that he thought that it was, and he saw that the 40SW was going to. So in a very, very short period of time, he developed the Glock 22, which basically was taking the Model 17 and scaling up the barrel, adding an extra pin to handle the more powerful cartridge. And he was able to beat Smith Wesson to the market with his Glock 22 before the 40 caliber cartridge came out in Smith Wesson's very own 40-06. And sort of to add insult to injury, Glock introduced their Model 22 to the FBI. Now, again, the FBI was working with Smith Wesson on this cartridge. Well, they ended up adopting the Model 22 over the 40-06. So Smith & Wesson never really made out on that deal at all. The cartridge would go on to become one of the most popular cartridges in law enforcement. Around the 1994-95 time period when it came out, the 40S&W was the cartridge for law enforcement. Probably, I would say, well over 70% of law enforcement around that time was using the 40S&W cartridge. And the most popular gun by far was the Glocks 22 and 23. There were other models that came out as well. Law enforcement had, you had Smith & Wesson, you had Beretta, you had Glock, you had SIG, HK. There were many companies that came out with 40S&W pistols, and it would really remain law enforcement's weapon of choice probably until the mid-2000s, when we start to see that pendulum swing back to where we're at right now, where we're seeing more 9mm use, because back in the day, power was the key. Diameter power was the key. Now we have modern propellants. We have modern projectiles. Modern projectiles basically give us the same performance terminal in a smaller one that you would need in a larger one. So with the increased terminal performance in the 9mm with modern propellants, modern projectiles, it doesn't give a lot of benefit to the larger calibers. And that was determined by the FBI. And of course, once the FBI makes up a change due to the fact that they have the resources to do all of this, where a lot of smaller departments don't, their testing is taken at gospel, and that'll take the law enforcement into that direction of going back to 9mm, which is what happened. So in 1990, the FBI adopts the 1076. The FBI initially ordered 10,000 guns. Well, after seeing the performance in the shooting with the FBI's trainees and with the switch over to the higher caliber, they found this was not a good idea. The FBI would only adopt less than 1,200 of these guns before they had to go back to the drawing board and go to a different caliber. January 1990, the 10mm light. The FBI, what they did was they took the 40S&W cartridges, as we said. It was basically a short or a Kurz version of the 10mm. Again, we're reduced between 200 and 300 feet per second. So in 1997, as we spoke about a little bit earlier, Glock basically decommissioned the 10mm except for some of their SRT teams, and they adopted the Glock 22. So we're going to take a quick mention of the different models that were produced by Smith & Wesson. Again, the one that we're looking at here is the Smith & Wesson 1006. Now, there was more of these produced than any other model of the Smith & Wesson 10mm series, and that was the 26,978. The 1026, which was basically the same gun, but it had a bobbed hammer, about 3,135. The 1046 was double action only, with a bobbed hammer, and that had the least at 151 guns. The 1066, which was a double action, single action, had a slide mounted safety with a bobbed hammer, 5,067. Now the 1076 again was the FBI one that was adopted, and that was 13,805. Then you had the 1086, which was double action only, bobbed hammer. Now the 1076 and the 1086 only had a 4.25 inch barrel, 4.25 inch barrel, where the other ones were around 5-inch barrels. So let's take a closer look at the Smith & Wesson 1006. Now again, we have a full stainless steel gun. Again, it's a relatively heavy gun, weighing in at about 38 ounces. It's a big chunk of steel. This particular one has the rubber handguards, but you also had the plastic handguards on there as well. Now, this one is double action single. So what we have here is double action. Your first shot, long drawn double action pull. Then when it would cycle, it would go into this the short single action mode. So with the decocking lever, you can decock the pistol. Now you have a manual safety engaged. Disconnects the trigger, so you can carry it with safety on or safety off. Now, if you look here, you have the fully adjustable rear sight. This came with several different types of sights, fixed sights, adjustable sights, which is basically a 3-dot system. stainless steel barrel. You had an overall length of about 8.5 inches on this one. The barrel is 5 inches. Now the magazine, single column, 9 rounds. Now this is a feature here that's been controversial for many, many years with several guns throughout history, was the magazine disconnect. Once the magazine was released, now the trigger would not work and the gun could not be fired. The theory being if the officer was involved in a scuffle, that if he ejected his magazine out, he wouldn't be shot with his own gun. There was 2 schools of thought on that. Many felt that if you were in an emergency situation where you were reloading and your target popped out in front of you, you would have a useless gun. Now, overall, most guns will not use a magazine disconnect. And Smith & Wesson also taught in their armor school, which I took in 1994. They showed us how to disconnect the magazine safety because there were many police departments who bought these guns and did want it disconnected because they felt that it was not safe. So looking at the left-hand side, as you can see, the manual safety, you have our slide stop as well as the disassembly latch, your magazine release. So we're going to show this how this comes apart. So what we do is here, go right over until the slide stop lines up with the notch on the slide. Push upward. We're going to pull out a disassembly latch. Now as we go forward, it's going to decock. We slide right off the frame. Now looking at the frame, as you can see, again, big chunk of steel. Now the one of the parts on here, and unfortunately I can't recall because it's been so long since I've been to the school, everyone had to be custom fit for the rifle. The one of these parts I recall from the armor school, I don't recall which one, it's just been so long, I think it was 1994 when I went to it. One of these levers here had to be hand fit for this pistol. It was the only part that ever had to be hand fit on it. Now when we look at the slide, we have our recoil spring guide, and we have the pin on the end of the spring guide, which is what locks the disassembly latch or slide stop into the frame. You have a stainless steel barrel, and then you have the slide. Now if you notice in here, we have the firing pin block safety, which again was the most important safety that you could have on any semi-automatic pistol. So the pistol was safe. So overall machining was excellent. Now the Smith & Wesson revolvers were always known to be very, very reliable. However, the semi-automatic pistols were never ever known for it. If you go back to the days of the law enforcement, were utilizing the 9mm at first. Smith & Wesson had relatively little of the market for the semi-automatic pistols. They just were not a durable pistol. The pistols were also submitted to the U.S. military trials for the XM9. They never got through the initial down select. The pistols had reliability problems, durability problems, firing pin protrusion problems. There was quite a few of them. So there were law enforcement agencies who, they basically refused to buy foreign-made guns because at the time the top pistols were all foreign-made. Beretta, Italian, Sig, German, HK, German, Glock, Austrian. All the top pistols for durability and reliability were all European. You did still have that select few who they were going to buy American no matter what. That's where Smith & Wesson got most of their sales in these early years. Reassembly, very simple. It just drops right back into place. Now, this is a very heavy spring. Now, due to the recoil, the heavy recoil of this cartridge, you do want to have a good recoil spring. You do want to make sure that you replace that recoil spring. Now, this is a little bit more tricky when we drop this back into position. We have to basically make sure that the hammer is forward. We have to push downward on the ejector, downward on your firing pin safety lever. Now we're going to drop this back over into that same position. Drop it into place. That's going to snap it into place. And there you have it. Now, one of the pistols I do want to talk about also is going to be the Glock 20. Now, the Glock 20 was the first commercial pistol that was successful. Again, you did have the Bren 10 prior to that. Now, something else we do want to mention is there was a lull in commercial sales after the Bren 10 fell off the market. However, there was a little bit of a lull in between the time where you had the bankruptcy with the Bren 10 versus the FBI's interest, and that was around the 1986 time period. Colt pretty much saved the 10mm from disaster, because in between that time period, they introduced the Delta Elite in 10mm. which is basically their 1911 chambered in 10 millimeter, and it had the Delta symbol on it, and they introduced it with an AR-15 A2 match H bar. And that sort of carried it through till the FBI gained interest in it. However, the Delta was not very durable with this cartridge either. This was just it was a little bit too brutal for a 1911 frame at the time. Colt would go ahead and have to redesign a little bit of their frame to accept the durability. But Glock truly was the first successful one, chambered in 10 millimeter. The Glock was a much more comfortable. It also held 15 rounds. It also had a little bit less recoil due to the fact that it used a polymer frame. One of the things that polymer does is it absorbs shock rather than has the steel hit steel like the 1006 would. So it was a little bit more successful, and as the Gen 4 came out with the dual recoil springs, it definitely increased its controllability, and it was quite successful. So then what we're going to do is we're going to take this to the range. We're going to see how it shoots. Now, overall, as you saw, the pistol for me was not too hard to control. Due to the recoil with both of them, these are not guns I would want to shoot all day long. The 40 S&W, the FBI short, that one you can fire all day long. The recoil is not an issue at all. Do I recommend the 10 millimeter as a self-defense gun? Personally, I would not. I think that the recoil is too much. I think for the average person, getting back on track with your follow-up shots is time-consuming. The muzzle blast, overall, I think what this really stands out as is a good hunting gun. Whether it's a primary hunting gun or a self-defense gun while you're in the woods in case your primary weapon fails or you have a grizzly bear coming at you. It gives you the power. A lot of people will compare it to the power of a 41 Magnum. It's definitely a little bit below that, but this definitely puts a semi-automatic pistol into the realm of a hunting firearm. And with all the different ammunition that's out there, which is another thing that I'll mention, if you look at some of the ammunition that's out there, the Federal American Eagle and some of the other ones, that is relatively light ammunition. That's like a little bit of a 40 S&W plus P. It's not the true 10 millimeter. Once you get into the Buffalo Bore 10 millimeter ammunition, now you'll see what a 10 millimeter really is. It's potent, it's hefty on recoil, and it's an extremely powerful cartridge. A lot of the self-defense cartridges that you'll find, the hollow points, those are proper 10 millimeter loads. But for the most part, a lot of the target loads are not nearly the highest pressure what the 10 millimeter is. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you do, please click like, please subscribe, and even better, share.